There's a moment in almost every church service that makes the room feel a little bit different. You may already know what it is. The energy shifts, the pastor slows down, everyone can feel it. It's that giving moment. I got to just be honest with you up front. I hated the giving moment early in my lead pastorship. At the time, we passed buckets, not plates. We had buckets, like actual plastic small buckets. And I always felt like I needed to make an excuse for the bucket passing moment. It probably wasn't as awkward as I felt, but our church did a great job of having non-church people and non-believers in the room. There were weeks I would meet people from every derivation of faith you can imagine. No joke. One week, we had a gathering after church just on kind of Next. I've talked about what Next was before, but it was a 10-minute conversation, and we had them fill out a little card, and it talked about just kind of like their faith background. I had a couple that was there for first time. They had been in a Baptist church for 30-something years. I had a Wiccan. I had a Universal Unitarian. I had two atheists. I'm telling you, our church was full of people who were not necessarily believers. And then we were going to pass the bucket. And I felt like I always needed to kind of excuse people out of it. And so like you, I would say things like, hey, if you're a guest here, if this is your first time, we don't want anything from you. We just want to give something to you. And I don't know. Everything about it just always felt a little weird to me. Maybe that's my issue, but I doubt it. I bet it feels weird for all of us at times. I think most every one of us understand that struggle. And it's a struggle beyond just the bucket passing. It's really a struggle with generosity itself. We all believe in it deeply. We teach about it biblically. We are all, I bet, engaged in it because you can't talk about it if you're not living it personally. You have to have moral authority to talk about it. So what do we really struggle with? And I think it's the pressure. I think it's the pressure of how money sounds. It's so emotional to talk about, or it's emotional for people. So when we talk about it, it just brings all this emotion up. I think there's pressure, as I said earlier, around how it's going to land with guests or outsiders. There's pressure around whether is it going to feel spiritual or transactional. And you know what? Over time, I think that pressure just creates a lot of hesitation. I've watched that in churches where, I work, as you know, I consult with churches all over the world, and I get to visit in churches a lot. I'm in churches almost every weekend, preaching and consulting and helping them think about bigger picture strategies. And I watch the services. I'm amazed at how frequently giving is not even talked about at all. And I think this is why. I think when we aren't sure how to do it right, that we hesitate enough where we end up just stop doing it. And it's a slow drift. We didn't just stop, but we went from really focusing on it to lightly focusing on it to now it just feels like we can do it maybe once a month. It's a kind of amazing. Here's what I want to suggest today, though. That hesitation that we feel, I want us to think of it like a leadership signal. It's like a leadership red flag. It's telling you something. And here's the deal. Giving becomes awkward when it is unclear. That's the issue. It's the lack of clarity that we have. That's why we feel weird about it. When generosity is treated like a financial necessity or like an expectation, instead of a discipleship step, pressure really starts to show up for leaders. And by the way, confusion is going to show up for the people in your church. But when clarity, you know how much I love that, but when clarity enters the picture, guess what happens? Pressure leaves for everybody. And maybe this won't be shocking. Jesus understood this better than we give him credit for, probably. Jesus talked about money, right, more than lots of subjects, right? And it isn't because he needed funding. It is because he knew that money reveals trust. Right, where your treasure is, there your heart's going to be also, right? So this wasn't a kind of fundraising statement that Jesus gave us, right? It's a discipleship statement. And you know what Jesus did? He used money as a mirror for the soul, for the heart. And that's where intentional leadership for us really begins to matter a lot. Like if we treat giving as a line item, you know what people do? They just feel managed. If we treat giving as formation, spiritual formation, people feel invited into something. In fact, one of the biggest shifts that intentional pastors make is just simply this. They stop treating giving as an announcement and start treating it as a pathway. Like every person in your church is on a discipleship journey of some sort. They are being discipled by something, and it might not be your church or by the faith, right? But something is discipling them. And when it comes to even their faith, they're not all at the same place. I mean, some people in your church, right, are exploring faith. They're seekers. Some are learning about spiritual habits. Some are deeply invested and ready to be stretched again. I mean, it's a pretty broad spectrum. And so when we speak to everyone the exact same way during these awkward giving moments, we actually unintentionally create resistance. But if we can speak to people where they are, clarity can start reducing that pressure. In fact, it can replace a lot of that pressure. You know what this means, right? It means that we have to start saying some things differently out loud. If we say something like, if you're new here, we don't want anything from you. We're just glad you're here. I mean, that's not a bad thing to say. It means that we're telling kind of growing believers, though, that, let me go back to that really quick. If we say that to the people who are new, I think that's great. I think we could also include something, though, but over time, we hope you realize that giving to something that God is doing in the world is one of the absolute best ways for your faith to grow. We're not pressuring them, we're not pushing on them too much, but we are teaching them something, right? If you think about like a person who's a growing believer, right? I mean, saying directly to these people that giving is one way that we practice trust. So where are you in this trust with God? Maybe you should just start there. For people who are really more kind of mature in their discipleship, but they need to be challenged a little bit, right? Maybe we would say something like, you've seen God's faithfulness in other areas of your life, or maybe even in your financial life before. What would it look like for you to take a leap and trust Him again? It's not pressure if you're saying the right thing to the right person. That's a huge part of my discipleship framework. It's called the 5 rights. I talk about that all the time. Go to gavinadams.com if you want to learn more about that. But we want to make sure the right person is getting the right message at the right time in the right way, because that's what leads to the best right next step for them. So if we talk to a guest and we talk about a deep challenge and leaps of faith, that's the wrong message for them. If we talk to a person who's deep in their faith and we just say, if you don't feel like giving, we don't want anything from you. I mean, of course, that's a terrible thing to suggest to them. But when we can say it to the right person at the right time, man, we're really moving the needle of discipleship and moving them along their discipleship pathway. Another intentional shift is really around what we celebrate. Churches, they often celebrate totals. I attended a church for a little while as a child, and maybe you've been in this church before. I don't even know if churches do this anymore. Maybe they do, but up on the left side of the front wall, they had a little plaque up there, and it had it was like a little wooden plaque with a little wooden little blocks that slid in and out for numbers, and it was last week's attendance and last week's giving total, and it was right up front. Some of churches have printed that in their bulletins. I don't even know if churches do bulletins anymore with digital space, but I mean, it's interesting when you put those totals up there. And again, I'm sure there were good reasons for that, but I think sometimes those totals can maybe create donors, but you know what stories do? Stories create disciples. Like when you tell stories of generosity as stories of freedom and stories of peace and personal growth, you really reinforce the spiritual why behind the practice. I mean, just for a second, think about how stories can work in your church. One thing a lot of you do is tell stories of life change, and then you connect it to giving, right? Because of your giving, this many students got to go on a retreat and 5 kids were baptized, and that's great, right? There's a whole nother thinking about this for a different episode. We'll talk about that another time. But still, sharing stories of life change and connecting it to giving is better than nothing. But have you ever told a story of giving that changed somebody's life? Have you ever talked about how giving has changed your life? I mean, a story of life change that connects to generosity is better than nothing. But a story of how generosity has created financial peace or freedom or growth for someone, that's an even better story. All right, let me give you kind of one more thing too that intentional pastors do around giving. They make steps in the discipleship pathway incredibly clear. Like all steps in the discipleship pathway have to be incredibly clear. Things like baptism, serving, community, all of that. This includes generosity. When people know where generosity fits in the discipleship pathway, they don't feel manipulated. They actually begin to feel guided. So let me just give you a very practical takeaway for this week. I'd love for you to just write a 20-second giving invitation for maybe each discipleship persona in your church. Now, if you're not familiar with discipleship personas, again, I talk a lot about this in the 5 rights, okay? But discipleship personas are kind of the characteristics or categories of the people that are in your church. In my 5 rights, we talk about the right person, and we talk about 4 personas that are in your church. The seeker, they're not a believer yet, but they're curious, and so they're there at your church. They're leaning in to figure it out, to see if there's anything in this for them. The student, new believer who's really growing in information, gaining, going to classes, going to small groups, like they're hungry for knowledge, right? They're kind of on fire, but it's still because they need to know stuff. The third one, those are our shapers. They're beginning to shape their life after Jesus. The 4th category, stewards. These are our disciples who are making disciples. So 4 giving personas. Now, you can use mine if you want, but think about the personas that exist in your church and just write a 20-second giving invitation for each of those personas. 1 sentence each, that's it, right? Think about how you would talk to that seeker, the first persona, versus the steward. How would you talk to the student who's learning about generosity as a new believer versus a shaper who's now beginning to shape their life after the ways of Jesus, right? That conversation, and it's a segmented conversation, helps add such clarity to that individual. Now, what you're going to find out is that you don't really need to overhaul your giving talks. What you need to do is overhaul who you're talking to when you have your giving talks. Because, right, giving is not just about supporting ministry. Giving is ministry. It's such a critical part of a discipleship pathway. And so when you as a pastor, when you can lead with intention in this space, everything gets better. Not just your budget, but a person's spiritual life too.